The storm had come down from the mountains with the fury of a vengeful spirit, turning the November night into a frozen nightmare that would change 2 lives forever. Natalie Harper's fingers had gone numb an hour ago, maybe 2. She could not tell anymore. The reins slipped through her clumsy hands as her horse stumbled again on the treacherous mountain path. Rain pelted her face like frozen needles, soaking through her traveling cloak until the wool hung heavy as iron on her shoulders. She had left Chico, California that morning with clear skies and hope in her heart, bound for Sacramento where her aunt supposedly waited with promises of work and a fresh start. The stagecoach had broken an axle 15 miles out, and the driver had suggested the passengers make their way back to town or press forward on their own. Most had chosen to wait with the coach. Natalie, always stubborn, always certain she knew best, had purchased a horse from a nearby ranch and decided to push on through the foothills. That decision now seemed like it might cost her life. The temperature had dropped as she climbed higher into the Sierra Nevada foothills, and what had started as rain had turned to sleet. Her horse, a gentle mare who deserved better than this foolish journey, whinnied in distress as another gust of wind nearly knocked them both sideways. Natalie could barely see 10 feet ahead through the curtain of freezing precipitation. She had lost the main trail at least an hour ago, following what she hoped was a path, but might have been nothing more than a deer track or a trick of the fading light. Just when she thought she might have to dismount and try to find shelter under a rocky overhang, something appeared through the storm. A light, faint and golden, barely visible through the sheets of rain but unmistakably there. A cabin. Someone lived up here in this God-forsaken wilderness, and right now that cabin looked like salvation itself. Natalie urged her exhausted horse forward, her teeth chattering so hard she worried they might crack. The cabin materialized slowly from the darkness, a solid structure of hewn logs with smoke rising from a stone chimney. A small barn stood nearby, and she could see the warm glow of lamplight through a single window. She half fell from the saddle, her legs nearly buckling when her feet hit the muddy ground. Her fingers fumbled with the reins as she tied the mare to a post near the door, promising the animal she would find her proper shelter soon. The 3 steps up to the covered porch felt like climbing a mountain. Natalie raised her fist and pounded on the heavy wooden door, the sound barely audible over the howling wind. She knocked again, harder this time, desperation giving her strength she did not know she still possessed. The door opened so suddenly she nearly fell forward. A man stood in the doorway, tall and broad-shouldered, backlit by the warm glow of a fireplace behind him. He wore simple clothes, dark trousers and a flannel shirt with the sleeves rolled up to reveal forearms corded with muscle. His hair was dark and slightly too long, curling at his collar, and his face carried the weathered look of someone who spent his days outdoors. But it was his eyes that caught her attention, even through her misery. They were a startling shade of green, and they widened in shock as he took in her bedraggled appearance. "Good God," he said, his voice a deep rumble. "Get inside." Natalie tried to speak, to explain, to thank him, but her jaw would not cooperate. She managed to step forward, and then her legs finally gave out entirely. The man caught her before she hit the floor, his arms strong and steady as he lifted her as easily as if she weighed nothing at all. "You are frozen through," he muttered, kicking the door shut behind them. The sudden warmth of the cabin felt like stepping into an oven, though Natalie knew the temperature was probably quite moderate. "What in blazes are you doing out in this storm?" He carried her across the small main room toward the fireplace, and Natalie got a hazy impression of simple furnishings, everything neat and well maintained. A table with 2 chairs, a rocking chair near the fire, shelves lined with books and supplies. Through an open door, she could see what looked like a small bedroom. "Can you stand?" he asked, setting her on her feet but keeping his hands on her shoulders to steady her. Natalie nodded, though she swayed dangerously. The man steadied her with one hand while he grabbed a thick blanket from the back of the rocking chair with the other. "Your clothes are soaked through," he said, wrapping the blanket around her shoulders. "You need to get out of them before you catch pneumonia." "Can you manage that while I see to your horse?" Horse, Natalie managed through chattering teeth. "Yes, please. I will be right back. Get those wet things off and wrap yourself in that blanket. There are more blankets in the bedroom if you need them." He grabbed a heavy coat from a peg by the door and a lantern from the table, then disappeared back out into the storm. Natalie stood shivering for a moment, her mind moving slowly through the fog of cold and exhaustion. Get out of wet clothes. Right. That made sense. Her fingers fumbled with the buttons of her cloak, so numb she could barely feel them. The soaked wool finally fell to the floor with a wet slap. Her dress was equally drenched, the deep blue fabric turned almost black with water. The buttons down the back were impossible to reach with her clumsy fingers. She was still struggling with them when the door opened again, and the man returned, his own coat now soaked through. He took one look at her futile attempts and crossed the room in 3 long strides. "Turn around," he said, not unkindly. "I can manage," Natalie protested weakly, but he was already turning her by the shoulders. "No, you cannot. You will freeze to death while you fumble with buttons." His fingers worked quickly and efficiently down her back, unfastening the long row of buttons with practiced ease. "I have a sister," he explained, perhaps sensing her tension. "I am not unfamiliar with the mysteries of women's clothing." Despite everything, Natalie almost smiled at that. The dress loosened and she clutched it to her chest as he stepped back. "I will turn around," he said, suiting action to words. "Get yourself wrapped in that blanket. Your modesty is safe with me, miss." Natalie shed the heavy dress as quickly as her shaking hands would allow, followed by the layers of equally wet petticoats beneath. Her corset and chemise were damp but not soaked through, and she decided that was good enough. She wrapped the thick blanket around herself like a cocoon, tucking it securely. "I am decent," she said softly. He turned back and she saw that he was carrying a steaming mug. "Coffee," he said, pressing it into her hands. "Hot and sweet. Drink it slowly." The warmth of the mug against her palms was almost painful, and the first sip of the hot liquid made her gasp. But it was good, spreading warmth through her chest and belly. She took another sip, then another, feeling slowly returning to her extremities in painful tingles. "Thank you," she managed, her voice still shaky but stronger than before. "I thought I was going to die out there." "You might have," he said bluntly, hanging his wet coat back on its peg. "This is no night to be traveling, especially not alone through the mountains. What were you thinking?" There was no judgment in his tone, only genuine puzzlement. Natalie found herself explaining about the stagecoach, the broken axle, her determination to press on to Sacramento. "Sacramento," he repeated, shaking his head. "That is still 50 miles from here and most of it through rough country. You would not have made it even in good weather, not alone." "I realize that now," Natalie said quietly, staring down into her coffee mug. "I suppose I am not very good at making sensible decisions." "Well, you made one sensible decision tonight. You stopped here instead of trying to keep going." He moved to the fireplace and added another log, stoking the flames until they burned brighter and hotter. "I am Xander Vance, by the way. This is my cabin, such as it is." "Natalie Harper," she replied. "And I am incredibly grateful for your hospitality, Mr. Vance." "Xander," he corrected, glancing over his shoulder at her. No need for formality when you are wrapped in my blanket and drinking my coffee." That almost smile returned to Natalie's face, a little stronger this time. "Xander, then, and I suppose you should call me Natalie." He nodded and stood, brushing off his hands. "You need rest and warmth. The bedroom is through there. The bed is clean and there are extra blankets in the chest at the foot of it. You should sleep." "What about you?" Natalie asked, looking around the small cabin. There was only one bedroom, one bed as far as she could see. "I will make do out here with the rocking chair and the fire. I have slept in worse places." When she started to protest, he held up a hand. "No arguments. You are frozen half to death and exhausted. You need a proper bed. I will be fine." The coffee was finished, and now that the initial shock of warmth was fading, Natalie could feel the bone-deep exhaustion settling into her limbs. She wanted to argue, to insist that she could not take his bed, but the truth was she did not have the strength. She stood carefully, clutching the blanket around herself. "I do not know how to thank you," she said softly. "No thanks needed. Anyone would do the same." He moved toward the door to check that it was properly latched against the storm. "Go on now, get some rest. We will figure out what to do in the morning when the storm passes." Natalie made her way to the small bedroom on unsteady legs. It was a simple room, containing a neatly made bed, a chest, and a small table with a pitcher and basin. The bed looked impossibly inviting. She found extra blankets in the chest as promised and piled them on the bed, then climbed in, still wrapped in her cocoon. The mattress was stuffed with something soft, maybe corn husks or wool, and the blankets were heavy and warm. She should have felt awkward, sleeping in a stranger's bed while he spent the night in a chair. She should have felt afraid, alone in a cabin with a man she did not know. But somehow she felt neither of those things. There was something about Xander Vance, something in his straightforward manner and kind eyes, that inspired trust. As she drifted off to sleep, listening to the storm rage outside and the crackling of the fire in the other room, Natalie found herself thinking that perhaps her terrible decision to press on through the storm had led her exactly where she needed to be. When Natalie woke, pale morning light was filtering through the single window of the small bedroom. The storm had passed, leaving behind an eerie quiet broken only by the occasional drip of water from the eaves. She lay still for a moment, warm and comfortable under the pile of blankets, trying to piece together the events of the previous night. It all seemed like a fever dream, the desperate ride through the freezing rain, the appearance of the cabin, the kind stranger who had taken her in without question. She sat up slowly, wincing at the stiffness in her muscles. Her dress and undergarments were still somewhere in the main room, hopefully dry by now. Wrapped in her blanket, she made her way to the bedroom door and peered out. Xander was at the stove, his back to her, doing something that produced a wonderful smell of cooking food. He had changed into fresh clothes, dark trousers and a different flannel shirt, this one a deep red that suited his coloring. In the daylight filtering through the windows, she could see the cabin more clearly. It was small but well built and meticulously maintained. The floor was swept clean, the few pieces of furniture were handmade but skillfully crafted, and everything had its place. Her dress hung over the back of one of the chairs near the fireplace, steam still rising faintly from it. "Good morning," Xander said without turning around. "I heard you stirring. There is food almost ready if you are hungry." "How did you know I was awake?" Natalie asked, surprised. "The floorboards creak." He turned then, holding a wooden spoon, and gave her a quick smile that transformed his rather serious face. "Your dress is nearly dry. I figured you would want it back. Thank you." Natalie hurried over to the chair and gathered up her clothes, which were indeed much drier than they had been, if a bit stiff. "I will just get dressed." She retreated back to the bedroom and dressed quickly, though her fingers still felt a bit clumsy. The dress was wrinkled and showed signs of its ordeal, but it was warm and dry and far better than a blanket. She did her best to arrange her hair, which had dried in a wild tangle, braiding it simply and pinning it up. When she emerged again, Xander had set the table with 2 plates of food. Eggs, bacon, and what looked like cornbread. Natalie's stomach growled loudly, reminding her that she had not eaten since early yesterday morning. "Sit," Xander said, gesturing to one of the chairs. "You must be starving." Natalie sat and looked down at the plate. "This looks wonderful." "Do you always cook like this?" "When I have eggs, I do. The chickens are not always cooperative about laying, especially in cold weather." He sat down across from her with his own plate. "I have a small garden in the warmer months, too." A man gets tired of hardtack and jerky quick enough when he is living alone. They ate in companionable silence for a few minutes. The food was simple but good, and Natalie felt strength flowing back into her body with each bite. When she had taken the edge off her hunger, she looked up to find Xander watching her with an expression she could not quite read. "What?" she asked, suddenly self-conscious. "I was just thinking that you have not asked me why I live up here alone," he said. "Most people are curious about that." "I figured if you wanted me to know, you would tell me," Natalie replied. "It is not really my business." He nodded slowly, something that might have been approval in his eyes. "Fair enough. But I will tell you anyway, since you will be stuck here for at least another day or two." "Another day or two," Natalie echoed, alarm rising in her chest. "The storm dropped a lot of rain last night. The creek between here and the main trail will be running high, too high to cross safely for at least a day, maybe 2 depending on how fast the water goes down." He took a bite of cornbread, seemingly unconcerned. "You are welcome to stay as long as you need to. I do not get much company up here." Natalie tried to process this information. Stuck in a cabin alone with a man she did not know for possibly 2 days. Her aunt would be scandalized. Society would be scandalized. But what choice did she have? "I appreciate your hospitality," she said carefully. "I promise I will leave as soon as it is safe to do so. I do not want to impose. It is not an imposition." Xander pushed his empty plate aside and leaned back in his chair. "And to answer the question you did not ask, I live up here because I like the solitude. I came out to California in '68 after the war. Tried living in town, tried working in the mines, tried a dozen different things. None of it felt right. Then I found this place, built this cabin with my own hands, and realized this was what I had been looking for all along." "You fought in the war?" Natalie asked softly. "I did. For the Union, if it matters." His face had gone distant, shadows moving in his eyes. 4 years of watching men die in mud and blood and wondering what the hell it was all for. When it was over, I could not go back to Ohio, could not pretend to be the boy I had been when I left. So I came west like everyone else, looking for gold or glory or just a place where the ghosts could not follow. "Did you find it?" Natalie asked. "A place where the ghosts could not follow." Xander looked at her, really looked at her, and she saw the pain and the loneliness and the hard-won peace in his expression. "Most days," he said quietly. "Most days I did." Natalie found herself wanting to reach across the table and take his hand, to offer comfort for wounds she could barely imagine. But they were still strangers, no matter how kind he had been, so she kept her hands in her lap. "What about you?" Xander asked, breaking the heavy moment. "What brings Natalie Harper to California, traveling alone to Sacramento?" So Natalie told him her story. About growing up in Missouri, about her parents dying of fever 2 years ago, about scraping by as a seamstress in a town that had too many seamstresses and not enough work. About the letter from her aunt in Sacramento, promising employment in a dress shop and a room in her boarding house. "I saved for 8 months to afford the stagecoach ticket," she finished. "And then I made the brilliant decision to keep going when the stage broke down. My aunt does not even know I am coming. I wanted to surprise her." "She is going to be surprised all right when you show up late and with stories about spending days alone in a mountain cabin with a strange man," Xander said dryly. Natalie had not thought about that. Her reputation, already precarious as a young, unmarried woman traveling alone, would be in tatters if word got out about this. She felt color rising in her cheeks. "I suppose I will have to lie," she said finally. "Say I stayed with a family or waited with the stagecoach." "I suppose you will," Xander agreed. He stood and began clearing the dishes. "But that is a problem for when you get to Sacramento. For now, you are stuck here with me, and we might as well make the best of it." "Is there something I can do to help?" Natalie asked, standing as well. "I do not want to just sit idle while you wait on me. Can you cook?" "Yes, fairly well." "Can you mend?" "I am a seamstress, so yes, definitely." Xander grinned, and Natalie realized it was the first real smile she had seen from him. It lit up his whole face, made him look younger and almost boyish despite the weathered lines around his eyes. "In that case," he said, "I have a pile of clothes that need mending if you are willing. I am hell with a needle, keep poking myself. And if you feel like cooking dinner tonight, I would not object. I will show you where everything is." It was strange how quickly they fell into a rhythm. Xander showed her his small but well-stocked pantry, explained the idiosyncrasies of his wood stove, and dug out a basket of clothing that needed attention. Then he pulled on his coat and headed out to tend to the animals and check his traps, leaving Natalie alone in the cabin. She spent the morning mending, working her way through shirts with torn seams and trousers with holes in the knees. It was peaceful work, familiar and soothing, and she found herself enjoying it. Through the window, she could occasionally see Xander moving around outside, checking on the chickens, hauling water from the well, chopping firewood to replace what they had burned through during the storm. He was a good-looking man, she admitted to herself as she watched him swing the axe with easy, practiced motions. Tall and strong, with capable hands and kind eyes. The kind of man who would make some woman a good husband if he ever came down from his mountain long enough to court anyone. The thought made her sad for reasons she did not entirely understand. Xander came back inside around midday, bringing with him the smell of fresh air and wood smoke. He had a brace of rabbits slung over his shoulder. "Looks like we have fresh meat for dinner," he said, holding them up. "That is, if you know how to prepare rabbit." "I do," Natalie assured him. "My father used to hunt them when I was growing up." "Good, I will clean them and you can work your magic." He paused, looking at the neat stack of mended clothes on the table. "You have been busy. It kept me occupied. And I wanted to earn my keep somehow." "You do not need to earn anything, Natalie. You are a guest, not hired help. I know, but it makes me feel better. I do not like being idle." Xander nodded as if he understood that perfectly. "Fair enough. But you are doing me a favor, not the other way around. I have been meaning to mend those things for months." He took the rabbits back outside to clean them, and Natalie set about preparing the rest of dinner. She found potatoes in the pantry, a bit sprouted but still good, and some dried herbs that would season the meat nicely. There were even a few precious onions, which she diced carefully, knowing they were probably a rare luxury this far from town. By the time evening rolled around, the cabin was filled with the rich aroma of rabbit stew. Xander had brought in more firewood and was now sitting in the rocking chair, reading a book by the firelight. Natalie stirred the pot and watched him from the corner of her eye, struck by the strange domesticity of the scene. It felt like they had done this 100 times before, like this was an ordinary evening rather than the second day of knowing each other. "Dinner is ready," she announced, and Xander looked up from his book with an expression of genuine pleasure. They ate at the small table again, and this time the silence was even more comfortable. Xander complimented the stew 3 times, which made Natalie flush with pleasure. When they were done, they worked together to clean up, Xander washing the dishes in a basin while Natalie dried them and put them away where he indicated. "You play chess?" Xander asked when the kitchen was clean. "A little. My father taught me the basics. I have a board around here somewhere if you want to play. The evenings get long with nothing to do but read the same books over and over." They found the chess set, beautifully carved pieces that Xander admitted he had made himself during his first winter in the cabin. They set up the board on the table and began to play. Natalie was rusty, but the rules came back to her quickly. Xander was a patient player, pointing out better moves she could make and explaining his strategy as they went. "You are teaching me to beat you," Natalie pointed out with amusement. "The game is not fun if your opponent does not know what they are doing," Xander replied. "Besides, I like a challenge." They played 3 games and Natalie lost all 3, but each game was closer than the last. By the 3rd game, she managed to take his queen, which seemed to delight Xander almost as much as winning. "You are a quick study," he said, setting the pieces back in their box. "Another few games and you would beat me soundly." "I doubt that," Natalie said, but she was pleased nonetheless. The fire had burned down to glowing coals, and the temperature in the cabin was starting to drop. Xander banked the fire for the night and added another log, then straightened and stretched, his spine popping audibly. "I should let you get some rest," he said. "Tomorrow I will hike down to check the creek. If it has gone down enough, you might be able to leave the day after." The thought of leaving should have filled Natalie with relief. Instead, she felt a strange twinge of disappointment. She pushed the feeling aside and stood, smoothing down her skirt. "Thank you again for everything," she said. "For taking me in, for the food, for the pleasant evening. You have been more than kind." "It is nice having company," Xander admitted. "I forget sometimes how quiet it gets up here." They stood there in the firelight, looking at each other, and Natalie felt something shift between them. It was like a string pulled taut, vibrating with possibility. Xander felt it too. She could see it in the way his expression changed, in the way his eyes darkened. But he was a gentleman, and she was his guest, and neither of them moved to close the distance between them. After a long moment, Xander cleared his throat and stepped back. "Good night, Natalie," he said softly. "Good night, Xander," she replied, and retreated to the bedroom, her heart beating faster than the moment warranted. The next day dawned clear and bright. The storm nothing but a memory except for the puddles that dotted the ground outside. Natalie woke to the sound of Xander moving around in the main room, and she dressed quickly, eager to start the day. She was not sure why she felt this anticipation, this fizzing energy in her veins, but she could not deny it. When she emerged from the bedroom, Xander had breakfast waiting again. This time it was flapjacks with a precious drizzle of honey. "You spoil me," Natalie said, sitting down to eat. "I am making the most of having someone to cook for," Xander replied. "It is more fun than cooking for myself." After breakfast, Xander announced he was going to check the creek. "It is about a mile down the mountain," he explained. "I should be back in a few hours. Will you be all right here alone?" "I am a grown woman, Xander. I think I can manage a few hours without supervision," Natalie said with amusement. He had the grace to look embarrassed. "Right, of course. I just thought, since you do not know the area. I will stay in the cabin and be perfectly safe. Go on." After he left, Natalie busied herself with tidying the cabin, though there was little to tidy. Everything was already neat and organized. She washed the breakfast dishes, swept the floor, and then found herself at loose ends. She wandered to the bookshelf and examined Xander's small library. There were practical books on farming and animal husbandry, a well-worn Bible, and to her surprise, several volumes of poetry and classic literature. She pulled out a copy of Ivanhoe and settled into the rocking chair to read. She was deep in the story when the door opened and Xander returned, his expression grim. "Bad news?" Natalie asked, setting the book aside. "The creek is still running too high and fast. Another day at least, maybe two." He hung up his coat and ran a hand through his hair. "I am sorry. I know you are eager to get to Sacramento." "It is all right," Natalie said, and was surprised to realize she meant it. "Another day or two will not make much difference in the long run." Xander looked at her searchingly. "You are being very gracious about this. Most people would be angry or frightened, stuck alone with a stranger." "You are not really a stranger anymore, though, are you?" Natalie said softly. "And I am not frightened. I trust you." Something in Xander's expression softened. "I am glad. Because I would never do anything to betray that trust, Natalie. I want you to know that." "I do know that," she assured him. The rest of the day passed in that same easy companionship they had found the day before. Natalie cooked lunch while Xander worked on repairing a broken hinge on the barn door. In the afternoon, he took her outside to show her around the property. The cabin sat in a small clearing surrounded by tall pines and Douglas firs. Behind it was the small barn where he kept her horse along with his own, a sturdy bay gelding, and the small coop with his chickens. A vegetable garden, now mostly bare for winter, occupied a sunny spot to the south of the cabin. "It is beautiful up here," Natalie said, looking around at the mountains rising in the distance. "Isolated but beautiful." "That is why I chose it," Xander said. "I wanted somewhere I could not see another soul unless I chose to. The nearest neighbor is 5 miles away, and town is 8 miles down the mountain. You go to town often, once a month or so for supplies, sometimes less in winter if the weather is bad." He led her along a narrow path through the trees. "I am not much for socializing these days." "You were different before the war," Natalie said. "It was not a question. I was a different person entirely, young and foolish and convinced I knew everything." Xander's voice was quiet, reflective. "The war burned all that out of me. What came back was someone else, someone I barely recognized. My own mother looked at me like I was a stranger when I finally went home to Ohio." "Did you stay there long?" "3 months. Long enough to realize I did not fit anymore. Everyone wanted me to pick up where I had left off, like nothing had happened. But everything had happened and I could not pretend otherwise." He stopped walking and turned to face her. "I am sorry. I do not usually talk about this. You must think I am bitter and broken." "I think you are honest," Natalie said gently. "And I think you are brave for building a new life when the old one did not fit anymore. That takes courage." Xander looked at her for a long moment, and Natalie felt that same pull from the night before, that invisible string drawing them together. This time when he stepped closer, she did not step back. "You are an unusual woman, Natalie Harper," he said softly. "Because I listen when you talk. Because you listen and hear what I am actually saying, not what you think I should be saying." His hand came up, hesitated, then gently tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. "I have known you 2 days, and I feel like I can tell you things I have never told anyone." "I feel the same way," Natalie admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. They stood there in the dappled sunlight filtering through the pines. So close, Natalie could feel the warmth radiating from his body. Xander's hand was still near her face, and she found herself leaning into the touch without thinking about it. "This is probably a bad idea," Xander said, but he was leaning in even as he said it. Probably, Natalie agreed, and then his lips were on hers and she stopped thinking altogether. The kiss was gentle at first, tentative, a question being asked. Natalie answered by rising on her toes and wrapping her arms around his neck, pulling him closer. Xander made a sound low in his throat and deepened the kiss, his arms coming around her waist to hold her against him. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Xander rested his forehead against hers. "I should not have done that," he said, but he did not sound sorry. "I am glad you did," Natalie replied honestly. "Natalie, you are leaving in a day or two. You have a life waiting for you in Sacramento, an aunt expecting you, a job. And I live on a mountain like a hermit. This cannot go anywhere." "I know," Natalie said, and her heart ached with the truth of it. "But that does not make it any less real right now, does it?" Xander pulled back to look at her, and the longing in his eyes matched what she felt in her own chest. "No," he said quietly, "it does not." They walked back to the cabin hand in hand, neither speaking, both lost in their own thoughts. The impossible situation stretched before them like a chasm neither knew how to cross. But for now, for this moment, they had each other, and that would have to be enough. That evening they played chess again, but the comfortable silence had been replaced with a charged awareness. Every time their fingers brushed passing a captured piece, Natalie felt a jolt of electricity. Every time she looked up to find Xander watching her, her breath caught in her throat. "I cannot concentrate," Xander finally admitted, sitting back in his chair. "I keep getting distracted." "By what?" Natalie asked, though she knew the answer. "By you. By the fact that I kissed you this afternoon and all I can think about is kissing you again." "Then why do you not?" Natalie asked boldly. "Because if I start again, I am not sure I will be able to stop. And you deserve better than a quick tumble with a man you barely know." Natalie stood and walked around the table to where he sat. She had never been particularly bold with men, had never really had the opportunity. But something about Xander made her brave, made her want to reach for what she wanted instead of waiting for it to come to her. "What if I told you I trust you?" she said, standing in front of him. "What if I told you that I do not want you to stop?" Xander stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. "Natalie, you do not know what you are saying." "Yes, I do. I am 22 years old, Xander, not a child. I know my own mind. And I know that I have never felt about anyone the way I feel about you. We have known each other 3 days. And yet I feel like I have known you forever. Do you not feel it too, this connection between us?" "Of course I feel it," Xander said roughly. "That is the problem. I feel it so strongly it terrifies me. You are going to leave and I am going to stay here, and this is going to end badly no matter what we do." "Then let it end badly," Natalie said, reaching up to cup his face in her hands. "But let us have this first. Let us have right now." Xander closed his eyes and leaned into her touch. "You are asking me to be selfish. I am asking you to be honest. Do you want me?" His eyes opened, and the raw desire in them made her knees weak. "Yes. God help me, yes." "Then that is all that matters right now." This time when they kissed, there was no hesitation, no holding back. Xander pulled her against him with a hunger that matched her own, his mouth demanding and possessive. Natalie gave as good as she got, tangling her fingers in his hair, pressing herself against the hard length of his body. They stumbled backward toward the bedroom, never breaking the kiss, hands fumbling with buttons and laces. By the time they reached the bed, Natalie's dress was half unlaced, and Xander's shirt was completely unbuttoned. They fell onto the mattress together, a tangle of limbs and gasped endearments. Xander pulled back just enough to look at her, his chest heaving. "Are you sure? We can stop right now if you have changed your mind." "I have not changed my mind," Natalie assured him, pulling him back down. "I want this. I want you." What followed was a revelation. Natalie had heard whispers about what happened between men and women, had pieced together enough from veiled conversations to have a general idea. But the reality was so much more than she had imagined. Xander was patient and gentle, guiding her through each new sensation, making sure she was with him every step of the way. And when he finally made her his, the brief flash of pain was swept away by a pleasure so intense it brought tears to her eyes. Afterward, they lay tangled together in the narrow bed, Natalie's head on Xander's chest, his arms wrapped protectively around her. His heartbeat was steady under her ear, slowing gradually back to normal. "Are you all right?" Xander asked softly, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. "I am wonderful," Natalie said honestly. "That was wonderful." She felt him smile against her hair. "It was it not? I have to admit I was worried I had forgotten how." Natalie propped herself up on one elbow to look at him. "It has been a long time for you, since before the war." "There was a girl back in Ohio before I enlisted. We thought we were in love, but I think we were just young and foolish. When I came back, she was married to someone else. I have not. There has not been anyone since. Not even in town when you go for supplies." Xander shook his head. "I am not interested in that kind of transaction. I wanted it to mean something, and it never did until now." Natalie's heart swelled at that. She leaned down and kissed him softly. "It means something to me too, more than I can put into words." They dozed for a while, warm and content under the pile of blankets. When Natalie woke, it was fully dark outside and the cabin had grown cold. She could hear Xander moving around in the main room, stoking the fire. She dressed quickly and joined him, finding him standing by the fireplace in just his trousers, the firelight painting his bare skin golden. "I was just about to wake you," he said, turning to her. "I thought you might be hungry." "I am starving," Natalie admitted. They prepared a simple dinner together, working side by side in the small kitchen. The awkwardness Natalie might have expected after their intimacy never materialized. Instead, everything felt natural, right, like they had been doing this for years. Over dinner, they talked about everything and nothing. Xander told her stories about his childhood in Ohio, about learning to hunt and fish with his father, about the sister he had mentioned who was married now with 3 children. Natalie talked about her life in Missouri, about her mother who had been a talented musician and her father who had made her laugh even in the darkest times. "I miss them every day," she said quietly. "But the grief is different now. Less sharp, more of a dull ache." "It never really goes away," Xander said. "You just get better at carrying it." That night, they slept together in the narrow bed, wrapped around each other like they had been doing it all their lives. Natalie woke several times to find Xander already awake, watching her in the dim moonlight filtering through the window. "What are you thinking about?" she asked the third time she caught him staring. "About how I do not want you to leave," he admitted. "About how I wish I could freeze this moment and live in it forever." "We still have tomorrow," Natalie said, even though she knew it was not enough. It would never be enough. The next morning, Xander left early to check the creek again. Natalie knew what he would find before he even came back. The sun was shining, the weather had been clear for 2 days, and the water would have receded enough to cross safely. Her time in this mountain paradise was coming to an end. When Xander returned, his face confirmed what she already knew. "The creek is low enough," he said quietly. "You can cross safely now." "I see," Natalie said, trying to keep her voice steady. They stood there looking at each other across the small cabin, and Natalie felt her heart breaking in her chest. This was it, then. The end of their brief, impossible romance. "You do not have to go," Xander said suddenly. "You could stay, here with me." Natalie's heart leaped, but reality crashed down on it just as quickly. "Xander, I cannot. My aunt is expecting me. I have a job waiting. I have no money, nowhere else to go. You would have here. I know it is not much, but it is enough for two. We could make it work. We barely know each other. We have known each other less than a week. I know you well enough to know that I am falling in love with you, Xander said, crossing the room to take her hands. I know that I have never felt this way about anyone. I know that the thought of you leaving is tearing me apart. That is enough, is it not? Is it? Natalie asked, tears beginning to spill down her cheeks. Xander, you are offering me a life of isolation on a mountain, far from everyone and everything. What if I come to resent it? What if I come to resent you? What if you do not? What if this is exactly what you have been looking for all along and you just did not know it yet? Natalie wanted to say yes. Every fiber of her being was screaming at her to throw caution to the wind and take the leap. But she had always been practical, always sensible, and the practical part of her brain was listing all the reasons why this was a terrible idea. I need to think, she said finally. This is too big a decision to make on impulse. Xander nodded, though she could see the disappointment in his eyes. All right, think. I will saddle the horses and we can head down to the main trail. If you decide to stay, we turn around and come back. If you decide to go, I will make sure you get to Chico safely. He left her alone in the cabin, and Natalie sank into the rocking chair, her mind spinning. Stay or go? Love or practicality? A leap of faith or the safe, sensible path? She thought about her aunt in Sacramento, a woman she had not seen in 10 years. She thought about the dress shop job that might not even still be available by the time she arrived. She thought about the life she had been planning, a life of respectable work and boarding house rooms and probably, eventually, a respectable marriage to some respectable man she felt nothing for. Then she thought about Xander, about his kind eyes and gentle hands, and the way he looked at her like she was the most precious thing in the world. She thought about the peace she had felt in this cabin, the sense of rightness, of coming home to a place she had never been before. She thought about love, and whether it was enough. By the time Xander came back inside, she had made her decision. I need you to promise me something, she said, standing to face him. Anything, Xander said immediately. If I stay, if I choose this life with you, you have to promise me that you will not let me become isolated. That we will go to town sometimes, that I can write letters to my aunt, that I will not lose myself completely in this mountain. Xander's face transformed with hope. Does that mean? It means I am choosing you, Natalie said, her voice shaking. It means I am choosing love over practicality for once in my life. It means I am terrified and excited, and I have no idea if this is the right decision, but I am making it anyway. Xander crossed the room in 2 strides and swept her into his arms, spinning her around. You will not regret this, he promised, setting her back on her feet. I swear to you, Natalie, I will spend the rest of my life making sure you do not regret this. I am holding you to that, she said, laughing through her tears. They spent the rest of the day making plans. Xander would take Natalie's horse and ride to Chico the next day to send a telegram to her aunt in Sacramento, explaining that she had found employment and would not be coming after all. They would need supplies before winter set in, more food and fabric for Natalie to make new clothes, perhaps a milk cow if they could afford one. We should get married, Xander said that evening as they sat by the fire. Properly married by a minister in town. Are you proposing to me, Xander Vance? Natalie asked with a smile. I suppose I am. He slid off his chair and onto one knee, taking her hand. Natalie Harper, will you marry me? Will you share this cabin and this mountain and this life with me? Will you let me love you for as long as I live? Yes, Natalie said without hesitation. Yes to all of it. The wedding took place 2 weeks later in the small church in Chico. Xander had gone to town to send the telegram and returned with news that he had spoken to the minister and arranged everything. They rode down together on a bright November morning. Natalie in the best dress she had been able to fashion from fabric Xander had bought on his previous trip. The ceremony was simple, attended only by the minister and his wife as witnesses. But when Xander slipped a simple gold band onto Natalie's finger and promised to love and cherish her, she felt like the luckiest woman in the world. They spent their wedding night in the hotel in Chico, a luxury Xander insisted on despite the expense. The room had a real bed with a feather mattress and clean sheets, and Natalie felt like royalty. They made love slowly and sweetly, taking their time now that they had the rest of their lives ahead of them. The next morning they bought as many supplies as they could carry and headed back up the mountain to their cabin. To their home. The first winter was harder than Natalie had expected. The snow came early and stayed late, piling up around the cabin until they were completely isolated. There were days when the wind howled so fiercely she was sure the cabin would blow apart, and nights when the cold was so intense that even piled under every blanket they owned, she could not get warm. But there were also moments of perfect beauty. Waking up next to Xander, his arm warm and heavy across her waist, sitting by the fire while a storm raged outside, reading aloud to each other from his small library, learning to snowshoe so she could help him check his trap lines. The first time she managed to bake bread in the temperamental oven, and it actually turned out edible. By the time spring arrived, melting the snow and coaxing the first green shoots from the ground, Natalie felt like she had lived on the mountain her whole life. The isolation that had worried her turned out to be liberating instead. No one to judge her, no one to gossip about her, no society rules to follow. Just her and Xander, building a life together one day at a time. In March, Natalie discovered she was pregnant. She had suspected for a few weeks, but when her monthly courses failed to arrive for the third time, she was certain. She told Xander over breakfast one morning, watching nervously for his reaction. He went very still, his coffee cup halfway to his mouth. "Pregnant, you are sure?" "As sure as I can be without a doctor's confirmation." Xander set down his cup carefully, then pushed back from the table and pulled Natalie into his arms. "A baby," he said wonderingly. "We are going to have a baby." "You are happy about it?" Natalie asked, relieved. "Happy does not even begin to cover it," Xander said, holding her tight. Terrified, amazed, grateful, but mostly just happy. The pregnancy was not easy. Morning sickness plagued Natalie well into her 4th month, and as summer arrived and her belly swelled, the heat in the cabin became oppressive. But Xander was attentive and patient, rubbing her aching feet and bringing her cool water from the well, never complaining when she snapped at him for imagined slights. In July, they made the trip down to Chico so a doctor could examine her and confirm that everything was progressing normally. The doctor declared her healthy and the baby strong, and predicted a late October or early November arrival. "We need to make sure you are in town when your time comes," the doctor said firmly. "I do not care how competent your husband thinks he is. Birthing a baby is no job for an amateur, especially a first baby." So it was decided that when October arrived, they would relocate to Chico for a few weeks, staying at the hotel until the baby was born and Natalie had recovered enough to travel. It was an expense they could ill afford, but Xander refused to take any chances with Natalie's safety. As it turned out, the baby had other plans. On a crisp morning in mid-October, Natalie woke to find her nightgown soaked with fluid and a dull ache in her lower back. She knew immediately what it meant. "Xander," she said, shaking him awake, "the baby is coming." Xander was out of bed instantly. "All right, do not panic. We just need to get down to town. I will saddle the horses." "I do not think there is time for that," Natalie said as the first real contraction hit, stealing her breath. She was right. The pains came hard and fast, barely giving her time to breathe between them. Within an hour, it was clear that she was not going anywhere. Their baby was going to be born here in the cabin with only Xander to help. To his credit, Xander did not panic. He boiled water, gathered clean cloths, and held Natalie's hand through each contraction, murmuring encouragement and support. When the urge to push became overwhelming, he positioned himself to catch the baby, his hands steady despite the fear in his eyes. The baby came in a rush at sunset, a perfect, screaming bundle that Xander placed carefully on Natalie's chest. "A boy," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "We have a son." Natalie looked down at her baby, red-faced and furious at being expelled from his warm, dark home, and fell completely in love. He had a shock of dark hair like Xander and tiny, perfect fingers that gripped her thumb with surprising strength. "Hello, little one," she whispered. "We have been waiting for you." They named him Jacob, after Xander's father. He was a good baby, healthy and strong, and he settled into their little family as if he had always been part of it. Xander was a devoted father, walking the floor with Jacob when he was fussy, changing his nappies without complaint, singing to him in a surprisingly good voice. Watching Xander with their son, Natalie felt her heart expand in ways she had not known were possible. She had made the right choice that day 5 months ago. She was sure of it now. The years passed in a blur of seasons and small moments. Jacob grew from a baby to a toddler to a little boy who loved exploring the mountain with his father. When he was 3, Natalie gave birth to twins, a girl and a boy they named Sarah and Samuel. The cabin felt suddenly very small with 3 children underfoot, and Xander spent that summer building an addition, 2 small bedrooms so the children would have space of their own. Life was not always easy. There were hard winters when supplies ran low and they had to stretch every bit of food. There were illnesses that terrified Natalie until they passed. There were times when she felt the isolation keenly and longed for the company of other women, for someone to talk to besides her husband and small children. But there was also so much joy, watching her children grow and learn and explore. Working side by side with Xander in the garden, teaching the children how to coax food from the earth. Evening gatherings around the fireplace, telling stories and singing songs. The quiet moments after the children were asleep when she and Xander would sit together on the porch, watching the stars and talking about their day. "You ever regret it?" Xander asked one such evening when Jacob was 7 and the twins were 4. "Giving up your life in Sacramento for this?" Natalie looked at him in surprise. "Where is this coming from?" "I was just thinking about that day you showed up on my doorstep, half frozen and desperate. What if I had just given you shelter for the night and sent you on your way? Your whole life would be different." "Probably," Natalie agreed. "I might be married to some storekeeper in Sacramento, living a respectable life and dying of boredom." Xander smiled at that. "So you do not regret it?" "Not for a single moment," Natalie said firmly. "You gave me more than shelter that night, Xander. You gave me a home. You gave me love. You gave me a life worth living. How could I possibly regret that?" "I love you," Xander said, taking her hand. "I do not say it enough, but I do. More than I thought it was possible to love anyone." "I love you too," Natalie replied, leaning her head on his shoulder. "My mountain man." They sat there in the gathering darkness, hands clasped, hearts full, and listened to the wind in the pines. Inside the cabin, their children slept safe and warm. Around them, the mountain stood eternal and unchanging. And between them, the love that had started with a knock on a door in a storm continued to grow stronger with each passing year. When Jacob was 10, they made the decision to send him to school in Chico. It meant he would board in town during the week and come home on weekends, and the separation was hard on all of them. But Natalie and Xander both agreed that their children deserved an education, deserved opportunities they had not had. The twins followed when they were old enough, and suddenly the cabin felt too quiet during the week. But Friday evenings, when all three children came home bursting with stories about their week, the cabin came alive again with noise and laughter. Jacob grew into a fine young man, tall and strong like his father, with his mother's quick mind and kind heart. At 18, he announced his intention to become a doctor, having been inspired by the physician in Chico who had treated Sarah's broken arm the previous year. It meant more schooling, more time away, but Natalie and Xander supported his dream with all their hearts. Sarah surprised them all by showing a talent for painting. Her sketches of the mountain and the wildlife that surrounded their home were remarkably good, and a visiting art teacher at the school encouraged her to pursue formal training. Samuel, practical and steady, announced he wanted to be a rancher and bought his first cattle with money he had saved from doing odd jobs in town. The years continued to pass. Xander's hair went gray at the temples, and Natalie noticed the first fine lines around her eyes. They were not young anymore, but they were happy, and that mattered more than anything else. When Natalie was 45, they received a letter from her aunt in Sacramento. The woman was elderly now and in poor health, and she wrote to express regret that they had never met after Natalie had sent that telegram so many years ago declining her offer of employment. She wanted to see her niece before she died, to meet the family Natalie had written about in her occasional letters. So for the first time since their wedding, Natalie and Xander left the mountain for an extended trip. They brought the children, now nearly grown, and traveled to Sacramento by train, a modern convenience that had finally reached California. The reunion with her aunt was bittersweet. The woman was frail and ill, but her mind was sharp, and she seemed genuinely pleased to meet Xander and the children. They spent a week in Sacramento, and Natalie showed her family the city that might have been her home. "Do you ever wonder what your life would have been like if you had come here instead?" her aunt asked one afternoon when they were alone. "Sometimes," Natalie admitted, "but I cannot imagine being happier than I am. Xander gave me everything I did not know I needed." Her aunt patted her hand. "Then I am glad you missed that stagecoach all those years ago. Sometimes fate has better plans than we do." They returned to the mountain with gifts from her aunt and stories of the city. But as the train carried them closer to Chico and the mountain beyond, Natalie felt her heart lighten. This was home. Not the city with its noise and crowds, but the quiet cabin in the pines where she had found love and built a life. More years passed. Jacob became a doctor and opened a practice in Chico, married a lovely girl named Emma, and gave Natalie and Xander their first grandchildren, twin boys who reminded Natalie so much of her own twins that it made her heart ache with nostalgia. Sarah went east to study art and came back with a husband, a fellow painter, and they built a small house near the cabin where they could work in peace. Samuel started his ranch in the valley below the mountain and married a rancher's daughter who was as practical and hardworking as he was. Xander and Natalie watched their children grow and flourish, watched their grandchildren arrive one by one, and felt the deep satisfaction of a life well lived. The cabin had been expanded several times over the years to accommodate visiting family, but the heart of it remained the same. The room where Natalie had spent that first night, the kitchen where they had cooked together, the fireplace where they had played chess and fallen in love. On their 30th wedding anniversary, Xander surprised Natalie with a gift. He led her outside to the barn, where he had been spending a lot of time lately on a mysterious project. Inside, he unveiled a beautiful wooden rocking chair, perfectly crafted and comfortable. "I thought you could use a new chair," he said. "The old one is getting worn out." Natalie ran her hands over the smooth wood, admiring the craftsmanship. "It is beautiful, Xander, but I love the old chair. It is where I sat that first night where I fell in love with you. I know. That is why I am not getting rid of it. This one is just for the porch, for watching the grandchildren play." They carried the new chair to the porch and sat together, Natalie in the new rocker and Xander in a chair he had made for himself. Their grandchildren were indeed playing in the yard, supervised by Sarah, who was sketching them as they ran and laughed. 30 years, Natalie said wonderingly. "Has it really been that long?" "Seems like yesterday you were pounding on my door, half frozen and bedraggled," Xander said with a smile. "I was not bedraggled," Natalie protested. "I was weather-beaten. There is a difference, if you say so." Xander reached over and took her hand, a gesture so familiar it was like breathing. "Best decision I ever made, opening that door." "Best decision I ever made was staying when you asked me to," Natalie countered. They sat in comfortable silence, watching their family, counting their blessings. The mountain stood eternal around them, witness to their love story, guardian of their home. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink, Natalie thought about that terrified girl who had arrived in a storm 30 years ago. She had been running from grief and poverty, hoping for a fresh start in Sacramento. Instead, she had found something infinitely better on a lonely mountain with a man who had given her his bed and, ultimately, his heart. Life had not always been easy. There had been struggles and hardships, moments of doubt and fear. But there had also been so much love, so much joy, so many perfect moments like this one. A family built on the foundation of a chance encounter and a choice to trust in love rather than practicality. "What are you thinking about?" Xander asked, reading her expression the way he had learned to do over 3 decades of marriage. "About storms," Natalie said softly, "and how sometimes they bring you exactly where you need to be." Xander smiled and squeezed her hand. "I will be grateful for that storm every day for the rest of my life." As darkness fell and the family gathered inside for dinner, Natalie took one last look at the mountain, at the home they had built together, at the life that had grown from a single act of kindness on a stormy night. She had knocked on a stranger's door, soaked and freezing and desperate. That stranger had given her his bed and in doing so had given her everything. The years continued their steady march. Natalie and Xander grew older together, their hair going white, their steps slowing, but their love never diminishing. They celebrated 40 years of marriage surrounded by children, grandchildren, and a few great-grandchildren who ran through the cabin with the same energy Jacob had shown at that age. On quiet evenings, they would still sit on the porch in their rocking chairs, holding hands and watching the sunset. Sometimes they talked, sharing memories or making plans. Sometimes they sat in the comfortable silence of two people who knew each other so well that words were unnecessary. "Do you remember," Natalie said one evening when she was 68 and Xander was 71, "how scared I was that first night? I thought I might die in that storm." "Instead you found life," Xander said. "We both did. It was true." Xander had been half alive when she arrived, existing rather than living, haunted by ghosts from the war. Natalie had been running from grief and uncertainty, looking for safety rather than happiness. Together, they had found healing and purpose, and a love that had sustained them through 3 decades and counting. When Xander was 75, he became ill. It started as a cough that would not go away, and by winter it had developed into something more serious. Jacob, now a respected physician, did everything he could, but some things were beyond even his skill. Natalie nursed Xander through that long winter, sitting by his bedside and reading to him from his beloved books, holding his hand through the bad nights, celebrating the good days when he felt strong enough to sit up and eat. "I am not afraid," Xander told her one night when his breathing was particularly labored. "I have lived a good life. I have loved you and been loved by you. I have watched my children grow and thrive. A man cannot ask for more than that." "You are not going anywhere yet," Natalie said firmly, though fear clutched at her heart. "I am not ready to let you go." "Stubborn woman," Xander said with a weak smile. "That is why I love you." But spring came, and with it renewed strength. Xander recovered slowly, and by summer he was back on his feet, thinner and frailer than before, but alive and grateful for it. They celebrated his recovery with a family gathering, all their children and grandchildren cramming into the expanded cabin for a feast that lasted well into the night. "To life," Xander toasted, raising his glass, "and to the woman who knocked on my door 42 years ago and changed everything." "To second chances," Natalie added, her eyes bright with tears, "and to love that endures." They had 5 more good years together. Years of watching great-grandchildren arrive and grow, of quiet mornings and peaceful evenings, of a love that had only deepened with time. When Xander finally passed, peacefully in his sleep at the age of 80, Natalie held his hand and told him she loved him one last time. The grief was crushing, but it was also familiar. She had lost her parents, her aunt, and various friends over the years. She knew the shape of loss, knew how to carry it, and she had her family to support her, children and grandchildren who rallied around her with love and comfort. But the cabin felt empty without Xander. For the first time since that stormy night so long ago, Natalie was truly alone on the mountain. Her children urged her to come live in town with one of them, but she refused. "This is my home," she said simply. "Your father is in every log of these walls, every board of this floor. I am not leaving." So they compromised. Sarah and her husband moved into the cabin with Natalie, keeping her company while respecting her independence. Jacob visited weekly to check on her health. Samuel made sure she had everything she needed from his ranch. Natalie lived another 7 years after Xander's death. 7 years of memories and family and quiet contentment. She rocked in the chair Xander had made for her 30th anniversary and thought about the life they had built together. She had no regrets, only gratitude for the time they had been given. When she finally passed at the age of 82, it was in the same bed where she had spent her first night on the mountain, surrounded by her children and grandchildren. Her last words were of Xander, and there was a smile on her face as she closed her eyes for the final time. They buried her next to Xander on a hillside overlooking the cabin, under the tall pines they had both loved. The whole family gathered for the funeral, children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren, a testament to the love story that had started with a knock on a door in a storm. Jacob, now in his 60s himself, stood at the grave and told the story one more time, the story he had heard countless times growing up. About his mother arriving frozen and desperate, about his father giving her shelter and ultimately his heart, about the choice to stay that had changed everything. "They taught us that love is a choice you make every day," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "A choice to trust, to forgive, to hold on through the hard times and celebrate the good times. They built a life together from nothing, and they built it on love. That is their legacy to all of us." The cabin remained in the family, passed down through the generations, each one adding their own story to its walls while honoring the memory of Xander and Natalie. The rocking chairs stayed on the porch, weathered but sturdy, a reminder of two people who had sat there hand in hand for 4 decades. And sometimes, on stormy November nights when the wind howled down from the mountains, descendants of Xander and Natalie would look out at the rain and remember the storm that had brought their family into being. A storm that had driven a desperate woman to knock on a stranger's door, and a kind man who had given her not just his bed but his whole heart. It was a love story that had endured beyond death, living on in the children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren who carried their names and their values. A reminder that sometimes the best things in life come from the most unexpected places, and that love, real love, is worth any risk. The mountains stood eternal, keeping watch over the cabin and the graves and the family that still called it home, guardian of a love story that would be told and retold for generations to come. A story that had started with 3 simple things: a storm, a knock on a door, and a mountain cowboy who gave a freezing woman his bed and in doing so found the love of his life.